So for the rest of today's session, we're going to talk about protection of the global commons. This is kind of like natural resources, but on a much bigger scale because it encompasses things like climate protection, like air quality, and not just things like timber or water or wildlife. The global commons are something that refers to the resources that belong to no one, so they belong to everyone, and they sustain all of us. There are resources that are not easily partitioned, like air. You can't put up a wall. You can't put up a biosphere and just trap that air. The global commons do impact all of us and have to be shared and protected. One really great thing about the U.S. government that functions well is our system of aligning international agreements with domestic laws. And we talk a lot about red tape and how bureaucracy makes everything take a really long time. But we do some things really efficiently because we've been doing them for so long. We do update federal laws to match new international agreements or treaties quickly and efficiently. There are many other countries, particularly in the developing world, where the system is not as efficient, and you end up with a conflict of laws between that country's environmental regulations that maybe aren't as strict and some new international agreement or treaty, and then the other parties to the treaty have to figure out how to handle it if that country is not in compliance. Because much like the state versus federal laws, if that country's laws are less than the international treaty, the other member states can try to enforce against them. And depending on how quickly their government's wheels of bureaucracy get moving, it could be quite some time, and they could accrue some economic penalties for not updating their laws and not meeting the new environmental regulations under the international agreement. So one issue with the global commons is ozone layer depletion. Remember, the ozone protects us and keeps the climate stable, keeps our atmosphere stable, and allows for life on Earth. Super important. Ozone layer depletion internationally is regulated by the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in 1987. It provides aid to developing nations and also gives a timeline for phasing out CFCs and halons, those chlorofluorocarbons and halons that we talked about in the air quality section. The U.S. did change the Clean Air Act deadlines for phase out of CFCs to align with this international agreement. The next one's going to get a little bit complicated because the U.S. exploited some of the weaknesses in environmental agreements that are made internationally and caused some other countries to follow suit, which made parts of the international environmental law completely worthless. Our second issue with the global commons, human-induced climate change. First, it was regulated internationally by the UN Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in 1992. It provided financial aid for programs and advised on the limits of emissions. The regulation and enforcement of this convention, though, was left up to the individual countries. That's the problem. The U.S. signed it. George W. Bush Sr. was in the White House. He agreed to sign the convention. Everyone had a photo op. It was amazing. But then Bush Sr. said the U.S. was not going to enforce it. He said it's not binding to us and we're not going to do it. But the U.S. produces a very large percentage of the greenhouse gases associated with human-induced climate change. And we were world economic and political leaders, so other countries who had signed the Convention on Climate Change said that if the U.S. was going to make it non-binding, that they weren't going to enforce it either. So they said, you signed it and you're not going to do it. That means we can do the same thing. So it eventually didn't have a lot of enforcement capabilities because everyone signed it and took a picture and smiled, but then bailed out when it actually came down to enforcement. So what happened then? Well, by the year 2000, nations were not meeting the standards. They were not actually anywhere close 5 years before those standards were supposed to be hit. Nobody was on trajectory to do it, basically. So the convention was updated, and it was updated in 1997 by the Kyoto Protocol. So this was even 3 years before the standards from the Convention on Climate Change were supposed to be in place. The Kyoto Protocol was legally binding, so they saw the loophole and closed it for the original convention that Bush Sr. had exploited. The Kyoto Protocol became legally binding for everybody who signed it. It did list specific amounts of greenhouse gases and other emissions to be decreased, and it gave a specific timeline. It had dates by which those goals had to be met. The United States did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. We still have not signed off on it. And Russia was the other big holdout. And in 1997, the U.S. and Russia were top producers of greenhouse gas emissions. That's not great. That's really bad. But Russia actually did finally sign on. They were the other big holdout in 97. They finally signed on to Kyoto in 2004. That brings us to the Paris Agreement from 2015. That's when it was developed. It is legally binding, and it also has non-binding target emissions decreases. However, the suggested emissions decreases by region and by country and by type are backed up by a lot more scientific data than in the initial Convention on Climate Change or in the Kyoto Protocol, just because science had advanced so much and there was a lot more interest generated in the research areas for climate change. Each country does determine their own target and then reports that to the UNFCCC. That's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the other big piece that it added to the Kyoto Protocol is that it established a global carbon market. And we talked earlier about creating a pollutant market or a trade-off market, like carbon offsets. And the Paris Agreement actually does that. So 170 parties signed on, and these are primarily nation states, and most of them were there when it was developed. The U.S. initially did sign, but Donald Trump in November of 2017 notified the other signatories of the Paris Agreement that the U.S. would be pulling out of the agreement. Technically, though, he can't do that. There, in the agreement itself, there's a cooling off period. So any member country or signator who wants to pull out of the agreement has a cooling off period of a few years that they have to wait. So will the U.S. be part of the Paris Agreement or not? Well, November of 2020 is the first opportunity that we would have to stop participating. That's the end of our cooling off period. And that happens to coincide with the same month of the election in 2020, so the presidential election. So we'll see what happens. The date of the election is after our date to pull out of the Paris Agreement. I am sure that that was done on purpose. But if it looks like the political climate is shifting, there is a chance that even an outgoing administration, if President Trump was not reelected, there's a chance that that outgoing administration would still honor our signature on the Paris Agreement. Our next issue with the Global Commons has to do with water. All of the oceans are connected. The water cycle makes all water on Earth connected, and we all need it to survive. So marine pollution is a huge issue that's associated globally with water. Pollution right now is the #1 threat to marine mammals, even more so than hunting. There are a number of regulations like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act and some of the international endangered species protections that have helped to increase marine mammal populations and curb some hunting practices that had gotten those populations pretty low. But pollution now is a huge threat to them. Marine pollution is primarily regulated by the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which sounds amazing, like a pirate code. It's not about pirates at all, though. It was signed in 1982, and the party states to the convention have to regulate and enforce it. The coastal states are authorized to hear cases. And remember, in this case, states doesn't mean like South Carolina. State means the nation state to the convention. Marine pollution is also regulated by MARPOL, the MARPOL Convention from 1978. But the largest regulation of it and enforcement comes from the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Another issue with the global commons is overpopulation. There are over 7.6 billion humans on the planet. There is actually a really cool website where you can find out exactly what number human you are on the planet. You put in the date you were born and the location, and it will tell you approximately which number human you are. That's cool. That's an aside, but it's really interesting. Overpopulation for humans is a problem because of resource consumption and food availability. It was recognized as an environmental issue as early as 1798. At that point, they started projecting that overpopulation would cause us to have to do some kind of population control because we were going to hit our carrying capacity, which I'll talk about next. The problem that was recognized in 1798 was because the population was exceeding food production capabilities. We are now seeing problems with land resources and water treatment or water availability as well. Carrying capacity is an ecological concept that calculates the number of animals of a particular species that an ecosystem can support with adequate food, water, shelter, and space. For example, 1 square mile of forested area has a carrying capacity of 7 skunks, 8 raccoons, 1 coyote, and 4 foxes. Now, humans have these are all medium-sized carnivores. And this is a good example of carrying capacity with something a little more objective than us. So a good place to see this is with our pet dogs. We have an average of 125,000 domestic dogs in 1 square mile in urban areas, so like New York and San Francisco. If you compare this to the carrying capacity of the 20 medium-sized omnivores that a forested area the natural system can handle in 1 square mile, that's a huge difference. The natural system is not able to process the waste of 125,000 domestic dogs in such a small space. It's also wouldn't be able to provide adequate food or water or shelter, and definitely not space, unless it was in the humans creating this kind of artificial environment. Humans like to pack ourselves into small spaces that are geographically desirable, but those spaces cannot support that number of humans. But we're able to do this by getting creative with industrial production of food and not growing it ourselves in our own space, by the use of advanced water and sewer treatment facilities, and by using preservatives for food and other goods so that we can transport those when they're produced somewhere else. But we have put the natural system kind of out of whack, and we're keeping our numbers, our pet numbers, pest animal numbers artificially high, and these can have some really severe consequences on the environment by increasing the amount of pests and disease that come when you have a large group of anything in a small space. Right now, humans are projected to hit our carrying capacity on the planet by the year 2200. At that point, the planet will theoretically no longer be able to support the entire human population, so it will have to start decreasing that population in some way. Somewhat related to that is the interruption that humans have made into the natural process or cycle of renewal. If you think about a forest, you have some trees that are older, you have some trees that are diseased, and you have some trees that are young and healthy, but there's only so much space. Forest fires come through naturally occurring forest fires or wildfires, and those are cleansing to the forest and part of the natural forest health because it clears out some of the debris that's blocking the soil on the ground. It kills off some of the pest species, and it gets rid of some of the diseased trees that are there, so it doesn't transmit that disease to other trees that are in that stand of forest. Humans, though, have interrupted that because we have things like pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers. We have advanced science where we can keep things alive for longer in not quite ideal situations. So instead of having this whole cycle of birth, growth, death, renewal, we've interrupted that and extended parts of it that are having some consequences. So before we move on, I do want to mention the zero population growth movement. It's one solution that's been proposed to relieve some of the environmental and social issues associated with overpopulation. It is the idea that each person should only have one child to replace themselves. So you and a partner would have 2 children together. Then each one of you would be replaced by those 2 children. So when you died off, the natural resources you had been consuming would be transferred over just to those 2 children. And the population would stabilize, and the amount of natural resources consumed would stabilize as the population maintained instead of increasing with each generation. In that scenario, theoretically, you would also have technological advances to increase conservation and efficiency of the natural resources you were using, so you might actually increase the resources available for that replacement child in a zero population growth movement. This would extend resources and improve long-term carrying capacity. However, most people do not like the idea of being told by any government that how many kids they can have or whether they're allowed to reproduce at all. This has been attempted in several places. The most famous example probably is China. They attempted to limit population growth with the one-child policy starting in 1980. And gender studies experts link this policy and a traditional cultural preference for male heirs. There are a number of reasons for that we're not going to get into at this point. But those 2 things together created a gender imbalance. So the gender ratio is off for Chinese citizens. By the year 2020, there will be about 30 million more Chinese men than women entering adulthood. There was an article I read that called them the extra men because there aren't going to be enough women to find a mate with for people who are living there. They'll have to go out of the country to be able to find someone of the same age range even to date or to marry. While attempting to address the issues that were caused by overpopulation in China, a lot of it had to do with environmental resources and natural resource allocation. But this Chinese one-child policy created some additional problems that are going to have some very long-term cultural, economic, and genetic repercussions for generations because of selective reproduction and selecting for sex, selecting for boys over girls instead of selecting for other traits that maybe globally people look at when they're choosing whether or not to have additional children. The policy was updated to a 2-child policy in 2015. So the birth rates have gone up, the ratio is changing, but there is an entire generation of people born between 1980 and 2015 that are going to have to deal with the repercussions of the one-child policy. Our next issue is biodiversity, or decreasing biodiversity. Remember from last time, biodiversity means a lot of difference in life forms that are in one place. Right now, 2/3 of all land species on the planet are in tropical rainforests. And there are decreases in all ecosystems, not just the tropical rainforests, that are due to an increase in human population, the need for wood for fuel, and that's associated directly with food production and needing fuel, wood to cook food, and also needing that wood to be able to heat water because water treatment is lacking in some places. And non-sustainable agriculture. These are practices like slash and burn, where you cut down large swaths of the forest to be able to grow crops there. But when you do that, especially in a rainforest, the soil that's there was only amazing because of all the trees that were there that were part of that natural renewal cycle. And after you get a few rotations through of that crop, the soil is no good. So you have to move to a different part of the forest, cut down more trees, and then replant those crops there for another couple of growing seasons. Threats to biodiversity globally are being addressed in some of the same ways that we're trying to combat those in the U.S. One of them is the CITES Treaty of 2004. And it's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And it has species that are listed in much the same way that endangered species lists are created in the U.S. Instead of calling it the Endangered Species List, though, in the CITES Treaty, it's called the Appendix. So their Appendix 1 is the list of endangered and threatened species. Appendix 2 are species of concern. So those are animals that don't quite make the list for endangered or threatened, but there are some aspects of that animal, its population size, or its habitat that is leading to some concern, and they might get bumped up to Appendix 1 at some point. And then there's Appendix 3, which is other protected species. So an example of this is the bald eagle in the U.S. Is the bald eagle endangered? No. Is it threatened? No. Is its habitat protected? Yeah, like its population's doing really good. But can you hunt a bald eagle? No. Can you eat it? No. Can you trap it? No. You should not do any of those things. It's a protected species in our country for specific patriotic and national reasons. Other countries have the same kinds of things. There are animals that, for whatever reason, is a protected species in their country, and the CITES Treaty recognizes that and has Appendix 3 for other protected species so that those animals are protected across borders. In addition to CITES, the UN created UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and it did a couple of new things. It was formed in 1976, and it created these biosphere preserves, so kind of like an animal or nature reserve, but these biospheres, at the very core, there was no development, no resource harvesting, no humans are allowed to be there. So these core biospheres are protected. Outside of that core, there's a buffer zone, which has really limited uses. That buffer zone is not as highly protected, but humans are not allowed to be there. There is no resource extraction from that space either, even for limited human use. And then on the outside, you have the biosphere core, buffer zone. Outside of that is a transition area, and in the transition areas, forestry is allowed, timber, recreation, human habitation is allowed there, and that allows for transition from that protected biosphere preserve all the way back out into the real world or the default world. UNESCO also has a number of conservation and sustainable use initiatives. Some of them are incentives for its members or nation states, member organizations, and some of them are subsidies. Some things the member states have access to that other non-members do not. But they have a number of programs and some funding that promotes conservation and sustainable use of resources. So the Debt for Nature program is not really an issue, as you would think of a negative issue with Global Commons. It's this really creative solution, and I wanted to make sure that I told you guys about it because it creates a market for debt for developing countries that helps the environment, which is kind of a crazy concept. These are legally binding contracts that are entered into, and the agreement is to protect habitat in return for canceling foreign debt. So NGOs, non-government organizations, nonprofits will engineer these plans, fundraise for them, and negotiate for them. Sometimes they can raise enough funding to write off that foreign debt altogether. Sometimes they'll help work to get discounted rates, interest rates on the debt, or enhanced repayment plans, and sometimes they're able to work within the member organizations or with government entities that they have close relationships with to get the debt transferred over, at least in part. But a lot of it is just fundraising and helping to bring people together to the table to cancel out foreign debt so that it's literally debt for nature. So some of the nonprofits that work extensively on this are Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, and the World Wildlife Fund. And our last issue for the Global Commons is probably not likely to be a big issue immediately, at least for Americans, and that is Antarctica. It is a potentially huge source of fresh water, a lot of land, potential resources, and there are not currently a lot of people who live there. There are no people who live there permanently, so it has a lot of potential future resources. But remember in the air quality section when we talked about that ozone layer hole that's over Antarctica, and it opens and closes seasonally, and it at one point was getting really, really huge and going into parts of South America. Well, when that was happening in the late 80s, people started freaking out. That's not in your notes, but that's what happened. People freaked out, and what they ended up coming up with was the Madrid Protocol. It was signed in 1991, and it officially designated Antarctica as a natural reserve to preserve the biodiversity and prevent environmental degradation. The U.S. did sign the Madrid Protocol, which is a surprise because we usually don't limit our resource exploration with international agreements. This piece of legislation is also unique because the nations of the world got together to protect one of the last wild places, and Antarctica itself is not a party to this treaty. It doesn't have a government, it isn't owned by anyone, and it doesn't have permanent citizens, but it is subject to this international law. That will do it for international environmental law. Next week will be our last lecture of the semester, and we're going to finish strong with South Carolina environmental law.